What happened at mile 24 that made the other runners get emotional? A father, a son, a wheelchair, and a miracle from the Virgin Mary that no one expected. And it all started with a sentence that a 15-year-old boy said while watching television. But before we continue, leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I would love to see how far the Virgin Mary's miracles are reaching. Now let's start from the beginning. In a small town in Wisconsin in the Midwest, tree-lined streets, harsh winters, and the kind of place where everybody knows everybody else. On one of those streets stood the high school where Albert Whitmore had been teaching for 19 years. Math. High school. 43 years old, hair already starting to gray at the temples, thin-rimmed glasses, and that calm demeanor of someone who's seen it all in a classroom. You know that type of teacher? The one who writes the equation on the board and waits, doesn't pressure, doesn't yell, just waits until someone gets it. Albert was like that, patient, methodical, a man who believed in formulas, in proofs, in things that could be demonstrated. If you asked him about faith, about religion, about miracles, he'd give that polite smile and change the subject. He wasn't the type who debated. It simply wasn't part of his world. But life has a strange way of putting us in situations that don't fit into any equation. And Albert's situation had a name. Jimmy. Jimmy Whitmore was 15 years old. He was an only child, and since he was 2 years old, he couldn't walk. Nobody in that family liked to keep explaining what had happened. It was the past. What mattered was the present. And in the present, Jimmy was a 15-year-old boy in a wheelchair who had more energy than most of the teenagers walking around on their own legs. Jimmy was one of those boys you meet and don't forget. You know why? Because he made you laugh. Not in a forced way, not to get attention. It was natural. He looked at life with a sense of humor that most adults had lost a long time ago. At school, Jimmy was popular. He had a group of friends who were always stuck to him at break, at lunch, after school. And most of those friends were on the football team. Seems strange, right? A boy who couldn't walk being best friends with the players on the team. But it made perfect sense when you saw the five of them together. Jimmy loved sports, truly loved them. He watched all the games, knew all the statistics, knew the plays, the tactics, the names of coaches of teams that nobody even knew existed. And when his friends came back from a game, from practice, from anything, they'd sit down with Jimmy and tell him everything. "So, how was it?" Jimmy would ask, and the boys would tell him every play, every pass, every mistake and every success. And Jimmy would listen with his eyes shining, asking questions, asking for details. He lived sports through his friends' stories, and somehow that was enough for him, or at least it seemed to be. There was another thing about Jimmy you need to know. Something that was different from his father. Jimmy had faith. It wasn't a forced faith. It wasn't a faith that someone had shoved into his head. It was a faith that had grown with him, natural as breathing, and the person responsible for that had a name. Ruth, his grandmother. Mrs. Ruth was Albert's mother. She was 72 years old, lived alone in a house 3 blocks from the family, and came to visit her grandson every Sunday after Mass. She was Catholic, daily rosary, Sunday Mass. A statue of the Virgin Mary in the living room. And ever since Jimmy was little, Mrs. Ruth would sit with him and tell stories. Stories of miracles, of people who had gone through impossible things and found help where they least expected it. Jimmy grew up hearing those stories and believing them. In Jimmy's room, on top of the dresser, there was a small image of the Virgin Mary, a gift from his grandmother when he turned 5, and every night before going to sleep Jimmy would pray. Not because someone told him to, because he wanted to. Albert saw this and said nothing. He didn't share his son's faith, but he wasn't going to take it away either. If it did Jimmy good, who was he to question it? But deep down, way deep down, Albert would sometimes look at his son praying and feel a pang of something he couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was more like he wanted to believe too, but simply couldn't. It was a Saturday in October. Orange leaves on the trees, that nice chill in the air, blue sky without a cloud. Albert and Jimmy were in the living room watching television. It was one of those sports programs that air on weekends with reports about all kinds of competitions. The two of them watched together whenever they could. It was their show. That day, after a segment about basketball, the host announced the next report, and now, an emotional story from a marathon last month. Albert didn't pay much attention at first. Marathon wasn't either of their favorite sports. But then the image changed. On the screen appeared a man running. Nothing special so far. But he wasn't running alone. He was pushing a wheelchair, a special chair, one of those racing ones, aerodynamic, with a young man inside. The reporter explained the story. The man was the young man's father. The young man had been paralyzed since birth, and the two had been running marathons together for years. The camera showed the face of the young man in the chair. He was smiling, that smile of someone living the best moment of their life. Albert looked at his son. Jimmy was silent, eyes glued to the television, mouth slightly open, that look that goes beyond words. The report continued. It showed the two crossing the finish line, the crowd applauding, the father hugging his son, tears, smiles, emotion. And then it ended. The host came back, said something about the next segment, and life went on. But Jimmy remained silent. Albert grabbed the remote to change the channel, but stopped. Something about his son's silence caught his attention. "Jimmy, you okay?" Jimmy didn't answer right away. He stayed another moment staring at the screen, even though the report had already ended. And then, almost in a whisper, as if he were talking more to himself than to his father, Jimmy said a sentence that Albert would never forget. "It must be nice to feel the wind like that, fast. Like you're really running." And that was it. Just that. Jimmy didn't ask for anything, didn't ask any questions. He just said that sentence and fell silent. Albert swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. He stood there looking at his son for a moment, at a loss for words. "You want to watch the rest of the show?" he finally asked. Jimmy shrugged. "Sure," he replied, and they kept watching. But the sentence stayed. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Albert was lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Linda, his wife, had been asleep for hours. The house was silent, but he couldn't sleep. It must be nice to feel the wind like that. The sentence wouldn't leave his head. In the following days, Albert started researching. In his spare time, when nobody was around, he'd turn on the computer and look into it. A marathon with a wheelchair racer, father pushing son, adapted racing chair. He wanted to know everything, what the chair was like, how much it weighed, how much it cost, what the competition rules were, how many miles were in a marathon, what the training was like, what he needed to do to prepare. And he discovered that this was more common than he'd imagined. There were competitions all over the world. There were fathers who did this. There were special chairs, lightweight ones, made exactly for this purpose, and there was a marathon in his own city. 26 miles. Thousands of participants. Albert looked at the calendar. October, 7 months until May. He did the math in his head. 7 months of training, 43 years old. 0 running experience. He'd never run more than 2 blocks in his life. It was crazy, completely crazy. But the sentence wouldn't leave his head. It must be nice to feel the wind like that. On Sunday, Donna Ruth came for lunch, as always. After lunch, while Linda washed the dishes and Jimmy watched a game on TV, Albert found himself alone on the porch with his mother. Donna Ruth looked at her son and saw something. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," Albert replied. "Albert, I've known you for 43 years. What's wrong?" Albert sighed. And he told her. The news story, Jimmy's sentence, the research, the crazy idea of running a marathon pushing his son. Donna Ruth listened to everything in silence. When Albert finished, she stayed quiet for a moment, looking at the yard. "Are you going to do it?" she finally asked. "I don't know, Mom. It's a lot I've never run in my life. What if I can't do it? What if I start and have to stop halfway? It'll be worse for him." Donna Ruth nodded slowly. Then she turned to her son and said something he wasn't expecting. "Make a promise, son." Albert frowned. "A promise?" "A promise to the Virgin Mary. If you manage to cross that finish line with Jimmy, you promise something, something that truly means something." Albert almost laughed, almost, but something in his mother's voice made him stop. "Mom, you know I know," Donna Ruth interrupted. "I know you don't believe, but it doesn't cost anything, and if it does cost, it's because it's worth it." Albert didn't respond. His mother got up, kissed him on the forehead, and went inside to say goodbye to her grandson. That night, alone in the darkness of his room, Albert thought about the conversation. Promise, Virgin Mary, things that weren't part of his world. But then he thought about Jimmy, about the image of the Virgin Mary in his son's room, about the prayers before bed, about the faith he didn't understand, but that did his boy so much good. And he thought about something his son had said once years ago. Jimmy must have been about 10. They were looking at pictures on the internet, and an image came up of a huge church, gigantic, with a tower that seemed to touch the sky. "What place is that?" Jimmy asked. Albert looked. "A shrine dedicated to the Virgin Mary." "It's big," Jimmy said, impressed. Jimmy spent some time looking at the photo. "I'd like to visit it someday." Albert didn't think much of it at the time, but now, lying in the dark, the memory came back. And before thinking too carefully about what he was doing, Albert closed his eyes and made a promise. In silence, without telling anyone. "If I manage to cross that finish line with Jimmy, I'll take him to see the shrine. If I can do it, I'll take him." There. It was done. Albert opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. He didn't feel anything special. No light, no voice, no sign, just the silence of the night and the sound of his wife's breathing as she slept beside him. But somehow, something had changed. The next morning, Albert woke up before sunrise. He put on old sneakers, sweatpants, and left the house without making a sound. He was going to start training. Have you ever tried running when you're not used to it? Those first few minutes seem easy. Your body is rested, your breathing is normal, you think it's not that hard. Then you hit the second block. Albert had to stop, hands on his knees, gasping, sweating, despite the morning cold. 2 blocks. That was all he'd managed. He walked back home, took a shower, and didn't tell anyone. The next day, he woke up at the same time, same sneakers. This time he made it 3 blocks before having to stop, and so it went, day after day, week after week. 3 blocks became 4, 4 became 6, 6 became a mile. A month later, Albert could run 2 miles without stopping. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, but it was something. That's when he told Jimmy. It was a Saturday morning, already November. Albert went into his son's room and sat on the bed. Jimmy was playing something on the computer, but stopped when he saw his father's face. "What's up?" Jimmy asked. Albert took a deep breath. "Remember that news story we watched? The father running the marathon with his son?" Jimmy nodded slowly. "I signed up for the marathon in May, and I want you to come with me." Jimmy was silent for a moment. Then his eyes widened. "Dad, are you serious?" "I am." "But you've never run in your life." "I know, but I'm training. It's been a month." Jimmy opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then asked the question Albert had been expecting. "Dad, a marathon is 26 miles. "I know." "You're going to have to push me 26 miles. "I know." "Dad, this is crazy?" Albert completed with a smile. Jimmy laughed, that loose laugh he had. I was going to say amazing, but crazy works too. Albert smiled. "So, you in?" Jimmy didn't answer with words. He held out his fist to his father. Albert bumped his fist against it, and it was sealed. The following months were the hardest of Albert's life. He needed a racing chair. He researched, found a used one for a price that fit the budget. It was lightweight, aerodynamic, with 3 wheels and a reinforced safety belt. It looked like a baby stroller from the future. Then came the real training. Running alone was one thing. Running while pushing 130 pounds of chair and teenager was something completely different. The first training sessions were a disaster. Albert couldn't keep the pace. His arms tired before his legs, the chair pulled to the side. But he didn't give up. He'd wake up at 4:30 in the morning, train before class, come back home, take a shower, go to work. On weekends, when Jimmy could go with him, they'd train. At first just half a mile, then a mile, then 2. Jimmy would joke around to keep the mood light. "Dad, I think I saw a snail pass us," he said during a Saturday training session. Albert laughed, even though he was gasping. "Very funny." "I'm serious." She waved when she went by, said goodbye with her little eyes. That's how they worked. Albert pushing, sweating, suffering, Jimmy cracking jokes, commenting on the scenery, keeping his father distracted from the pain. But there were serious moments, too. On a Sunday in December, after a particularly difficult training session, Albert was sitting on the curb trying to catch his breath. Jimmy was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Albert wasn't expecting. "Dad, if it doesn't work out, it's okay." Albert looked at his son. "What do you mean?" "I'm serious. If on the day of the marathon you realize you're not going to make it, you can stop. I won't be sad. Just you trying is already worth it." Albert didn't answer right away. He looked at his son, at the chair, at the long stretch of asphalt they still had ahead of them. "We'll make it," he said finally. "We'll make it." And they kept training. January, February, March. Albert kept increasing the distance. 5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles. His body adapted. His arms got stronger. His legs could take more. His breathing improved. But 26 miles was a lot more than 15. In April, a month before the marathon, Albert did a test. He tried to run 20 miles pushing the empty chair, without Jimmy, just the chair. He made it, but he almost passed out at the end. He got home staggering, drank 2 liters of water, and slept 12 hours straight. Linda was worried. Donna Ruth was worried. Even Jimmy was worried. But Albert wasn't going to give up. Not now, not after everything. May arrived. The day of the marathon dawned cold. That early spring cold in Wisconsin when the sun is there but doesn't really warm things up. Gray sky with some scattered clouds. Forecast for stable weather, no rain. Albert woke up at 4 in the morning. He hadn't slept well all night. His stomach was in knots, that nervousness that won't let you relax. He got up, took a shower, put on his running clothes. Black shorts, red t-shirt, sneakers that had already covered hundreds of miles in training. On the chest of the t-shirt, he'd had something printed. 2 words. Jimmy's dad. Jimmy woke up excited. More excited than his father, that was for sure. He wouldn't stop talking while his mother helped him get ready. Donna Ruth had arrived the night before to come along. Linda was going to wait at the finish line. At 6 in the morning, Albert and Jimmy arrived at the starting line. Thousands of runners, all ages, all types, some stretching, some talking, some with that look of people who didn't sleep well either. Albert set up the racing chair, put Jimmy in, adjusted the belt, checked the wheels. Everything was ready. The other runners looked. Some smiled, some waved. A woman came up to them and said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Jimmy smiled at her. "We haven't even started yet." At 7 o'clock sharp, they were off. And it began. The first miles were as Albert expected. The adrenaline carried him. His body was rested. His energy was high. The crowd on the sides gave that extra boost. Jimmy was commenting on everything. "Dad, look at all these people. This is so much bigger than it looks on TV." "I know, son." "Look at that guy in a costume. It's a banana. The guy is dressed as a banana." Albert laughed. It was true. There was a runner dressed as a giant yellow banana, running along with everyone else. Dad, if he can make it dressed as a banana, you can make it pushing me. You bet. The crowd applauded when they passed. Shouts of encouragement, applause, people taking pictures. Albert tried not to pay too much attention, keeping his focus on the pace, on his breathing, on his feet hitting the asphalt. Mile 1, Mile 2, Mile 3, so far so good. Mile 6 arrived and his body started to complain. It wasn't pain yet. It was more of a warning. His shoulders saying they were there, his legs saying they'd collect later. Albert adjusted the pace, slower, saving energy. There were still 20 miles to go. Jimmy noticed. "Everything okay, Dad?" "Yeah." "Just controlling the pace. Breathe deep, take it easy." Albert smiled. Look at that. His son giving advice to his father. Mile 9, Mile 10. Other runners passed by, some waving, some shouting encouragement. "You guys are amazing," yelled a guy in a blue shirt as he passed. "Go, Dad," yelled another one further back. Albert just nodded. No breath to answer. Mile 13 halfway. 13 miles done, 13 miles ahead. His body was no longer just warning. Now it was really complaining. His arms burned from pushing the chair. His shoulders felt like they were going to come loose. His legs felt heavy, as if they had lead inside. Jimmy noticed his father had stopped talking. "Dad!" "I'm fine," Albert answered. "You're not talking," Jimmy said. "I'm saving breath," his father replied. Each mile was a battle. Each step was a negotiation between the body that wanted to stop and the mind that said to keep going. The crowd kept shouting. The runners kept passing. The sun started to appear between the clouds, warming the asphalt. Mile 18. Albert felt a sharp pain in his right knee, the kind of pain that makes you think about whether you should continue or not. He ignored it, kept pushing. Mile 19. 7 miles ahead. 7 miles seemed like an eternity. It was at mile 20 that things started to get really difficult. Albert's body hit what marathoners call the wall. That moment when the energy runs out, the muscles burn, and each step seems impossible. His arms didn't want to push anymore. His legs didn't want to run anymore. But he kept going. Mile 21. Jimmy wasn't saying anything anymore. He just looked at his father from time to time, worried. Mile 22. Albert started to slow down, not by choice. His body just wouldn't go any faster. Mile 23. 3 miles left, just 3 miles. But 3 miles seemed like 30. The pace dropped even more. Albert was barely running anymore. It was more of a dragging jog, his feet barely leaving the ground. The blisters on his feet had burst. Each step was agony. His breathing was out of control, gasping, that kind of breathlessness that hurts. "Dad?" Jimmy called, his voice worried. Albert didn't answer. He didn't have the breath to answer. "Dad, look at me." Albert met his son's eyes. "I'm already running, Dad," Jimmy said. "Since the first mile, you made me run." Albert felt his eyes burning. He didn't know if it was sweat or tears, probably both. "We'll make it," he murmured, more to himself than to his son. "We'll make it." And he kept going. Mile 23 and a half. Albert's body started to shut down. Black spots started appearing in his vision. Sound seemed to come from far away. His legs moved on autopilot without him commanding them anymore. The crowd was shouting, "Go! Go! Go!" "You can do it!" Applause, whistles, shouts of encouragement. But it wasn't enough. Mile 24. Albert felt his right foot catch on something. An irregularity in the asphalt, a little hole, anything. And he fell. His knee hit the ground first, then his hands. The impact echoed through his whole body. Jimmy's chair stopped abruptly. Silence fell over the nearby crowd. That silence when everyone holds their breath at the same time. "Dad!" Jimmy shouted, trying to turn in the chair to see. "Dad, are you okay?" Albert was on the asphalt. His hand scraped, his knee injured, his vision blurring. He tried to get up. His legs didn't obey. Runners passed by, looking, some slowing down, wanting to help, but they couldn't. If anyone helped, Albert and Jimmy would be disqualified. A volunteer approached. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need medical assistance?" If Albert said yes, it was over. The marathon ended there. He shook his head. No, he wasn't going to accept help. He wasn't going to give up. But his body wouldn't get up. "Now, Dad!" Jimmy's voice again, trembling now. "Dad, stop! Stop, Dad!" Albert tried to answer. He couldn't. Only a groan came out. "We don't need to finish," Jimmy said, his voice choked. "Look how far we got, Dad. 23 miles. That's already a lot. That's more than anyone expected." Albert stayed there on his knees, hands on the asphalt, trying to breathe. "Dad, you're going to pass out. Stop, please. I don't want you to hurt yourself because of me." It wasn't because of Jimmy. It was for Jimmy. There was a difference. But Albert couldn't explain, couldn't speak. "It's already been worth it, Dad," Jimmy said, crying now. "It's already been so worth it. Please, let's stop." Albert closed his eyes. His whole body hurt. Every muscle, every bone, every cell screaming for him to stop. "It's over," he thought. "It's over." And that's when it happened. Albert was with his eyes closed, trying to gather any remaining strength he still had. The noise from the crowd was a distant buzz. Jimmy's voice was an echo. He opened his eyes, and he saw. On the side of the course, in the middle of the crowd, there was a woman. She was standing still, motionless. While everyone around her was moving, shouting, waving, she was completely still, and she was wearing blue, a blue dress or blue mantle. Albert couldn't say. He only knew it was blue. The woman was looking directly at him, not at Jimmy, not at the marathon. At him. Albert Whitmore, kneeling on the asphalt. And she smiled. A smile that Albert couldn't explain. It wasn't a smile of pity. It wasn't a smile of encouragement like the others. It was a smile of, he didn't know what, of peace, of certainty, of something beyond what he knew. And then came the smell. Roses, the smell of roses. Strong, clear. In the middle of the asphalt, the sweat, the exhaustion, the scraped knee, the smell of roses. Albert blinked. The woman wasn't there anymore. He looked around. The normal crowd. People in t-shirts, caps, costumes. Nobody in blue. Nobody standing still. But the smell was still there. Roses, unmistakable. And a strange thing happened. The legs that wouldn't respond, responded. The pain that paralyzed diminished. It didn't disappear. It didn't go away completely, but it diminished. Enough. Albert didn't understand. It didn't make sense. Seconds ago he couldn't get up. Now he could. He stood up. The crowd exploded in applause. "Dad!" Jimmy shouted, not believing it. "Dad, what happened?" Albert didn't answer. He had no words, no explanation. He just grabbed the handle of the chair and ran. "Dad, you don't have to," Jimmy shouted, still crying. "I'm already happy, Dad. You've already done more than enough." Albert didn't answer. He just ran. "Dad, stop hurting yourself because of me." But Albert didn't stop, because it wasn't because of Jimmy. It was for Jimmy, and for what he had just seen, or thought he had seen. Or he didn't know anymore. The mile that should have been the end became the new beginning. Albert ran like he hadn't run the entire marathon. Where did that energy come from? He didn't know. It didn't make sense. The body that was shutting down now worked. The legs that wouldn't respond now obeyed. The pain that paralyzed was now just a nuisance in the background. The other runners noticed. Some who had passed during the fall now looked back, not believing it. The man who was on the ground was now flying. The crowd shouted louder, "Go, go, go!" The applause grew. Someone started shouting, "Jimmy! Jimmy! Jimmy!" And others joined the chorus. Jimmy felt the wind on his face, that wind he had dreamed of feeling, fast, as if he were really running. And he was. Finally he was. Mile 25, 1 mile ahead, a little over 1 mile. Nothing. Easy. Albert could almost see the finish line on the horizon. Jimmy craned his neck, trying to see. "Dad." "Dad, I can see it," he said, his voice still choked with emotion. Albert didn't answer. He just ran, half a mile. The crowd now formed a human corridor, people on both sides shouting, applauding, some crying, a father and a son, a wheelchair, a story that nobody there would forget. 400 meters. Albert could see the arch of the finish line, the flags, the giant clock marking the time. 300 meters. Albert's body wanted to stop. The pain was coming back. The adrenaline from the inexplicable moment was wearing off, but he wasn't going to stop now. Not when there was so little left. 200 meters, 50, 10, finish line. Albert and Jimmy crossed together, father pushing, son feeling the wind, together. The time didn't matter. 5 hours, 6 hours, it made no difference. What mattered was that they had made it. Albert let go of the chair's handle. His legs finally gave out. He fell to his knees in front of his son. Jimmy was crying, laughing and crying, tears running down his face, that huge smile that didn't fit on his face. "We ran, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "We really ran." Albert hugged his son. He cried like he hadn't cried in years, decades maybe. He cried for everything, for the training, for the pain, for the fall, for the woman in blue, for the smell of roses, for things he didn't understand and didn't know if he wanted to understand. Linda came running, made her way through the crowd, hugged them both. Donna Ruth came right behind, the rosary still in her hand, tears running down her face. Nobody said anything for a moment. Just the embrace, just the tears, just the certainty that something had happened there that went beyond a marathon. Later, much later, when the adrenaline had worn off and they were at home, Albert told them. They were all in the living room, Linda on the couch, Donna Ruth in the armchair. Albert standing still, limping a little from his scraped knee. "I saw something," he said, "at mile 24, when I fell." Everyone fell silent. There was a woman, in blue, standing still in the middle of the crowd, looking at me. Jimmy's eyes widened. She smiled, and there came a smell of roses, strong. And then I blinked, and she wasn't there anymore. Linda looked at her husband. "Albert." "I know how it sounds," he said. "I know. It could have been exhaustion. It could have been my vision blurring. It could have been anything." "But," asked Donna Ruth, her voice calm. Albert swallowed hard. "But I was able to get up. I couldn't get up, and suddenly I could. I couldn't run, and suddenly I ran better than the entire marathon." The silence in the room was total. Jimmy was the first to speak, and he said something simple, without drama, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It was the Virgin Mary, Dad." Albert looked at his son. "You think so?" "I don't think so. I know." Donna Ruth made the sign of the cross. She didn't say anything. She just smiled, that smile of someone who doesn't need any more explanation. Linda took her husband's hand. "You made a promise," she said quietly. "Before the marathon. Your mother told me." Albert looked at his mother. Donna Ruth shrugged. "What was the promise?" asked Jimmy. Albert took a deep breath. "If I managed to cross the finish line with you, I was going to take you to see the shrine of the Virgin Mary." Jimmy's eyes widened again, this time with a different gleam. "The big shrine? The one from the picture?" "That's the one." Jimmy looked at his grandmother. Donna Ruth was crying again but smiling at the same time. "When are we going?" asked Jimmy. 3 weeks later, the Whitmore family was in a car on the road, Albert driving, Linda in the passenger seat, Jimmy and Donna Ruth in the back seat. 10 hours of travel. They did it in 2 days, stopping to sleep along the way. And on a Thursday morning, they arrived. The shrine is hard to describe for those who have never seen it. It's enormous. Towers that seem to touch the sky, stained glass windows in colors, mosaics that tell stories from centuries ago. Jimmy fell silent when he saw it, that silence of when we see something so big that words don't work. Albert pushed his son's chair through the entire shrine, every chapel, every altar, every image. Donna Ruth went along, telling stories, explaining who each saint was, each mosaic, each symbol. And then they reached the chapel of the Virgin Mary. It was smaller than the others, simpler, but there was something there that made you want to stay. Jimmy asked to stop. Albert stopped the chair in front of the altar. The boy put his hands together and closed his eyes. He stayed silent for a long moment, praying the way his grandmother had taught him. Donna Ruth stayed beside her grandson, kneeling on the bench praying with him. Linda stayed behind in silence, respecting the moment. And Albert? Albert stood beside his son's chair. He didn't pray. He didn't know how to pray. He had never learned. But he stayed silent, looking at the image of the Virgin Mary, thinking about the woman in blue at mile 24, about the smell of roses, about the strength that came from somewhere he couldn't explain. And for the first time in his life, Albert, a man of numbers and certainties, considered the possibility that there were things that didn't fit into any equation. He didn't become religious overnight. He didn't start going to Mass every Sunday, but something changed. He stopped needing to prove everything. He stopped thinking that only what could be measured existed. He began to accept that life had mysteries he wasn't going to understand. And that maybe, just maybe, that's what made life worth living. In the following weeks, the story of Albert and Jimmy spread. Albert's students commented on it. Jimmy's friends commented on it. Jimmy told the story always the same way. My dad ran a marathon pushing me, 26 miles, and at mile 24 he fell. Everyone thought it was over. But he got up, and we crossed the finish line together. Friends would ask how he had managed it. Jimmy would shrug and smile. I don't know, but he did it. I felt the wind, he'd say, his eyes shining, fast, like I was really running. And you know what else? I ran. That day, I ran. Months later, on a normal school day, Albert was at the board writing an equation. The same classroom as always, the same students, the same chalk making that noise on the board. But he wasn't the same. He stopped writing for a moment, looked out the window. The afternoon sun came through the glass, making shadows on the floor. A student noticed the pause. Mr. Whitmore, is everything okay? Albert turned around, looked at the class. 20-something students looking at him, waiting. He smiled, a small smile, almost imperceptible. Everything's fine, he said, just thinking. And he went back to writing the equation. But that night at home after dinner, Albert sat on the porch and looked at the stars. Linda came to keep him company, sat beside him without saying anything. After a while, Albert said, I still don't know what happened that day. I know, Linda replied. You know? I know, but it doesn't need an explanation. Some things just are. Horror. Albert stayed silent, thinking about that, and for the first time it didn't bother him. In Jimmy's room, the boy was in front of the image of the Virgin Mary that his grandmother had given him years ago, hands together, eyes closed, praying, like every night, like always. And on his nightstand, along with the sports books and video game controllers, there was something new. A medal, the marathon medal. The Jimmy's Dad t-shirt was folded under the medal, father and son. A wheelchair. 26 miles, a fall, a woman in blue, a smell of roses, and an ending nobody expected. Some call it coincidence, others call it luck, others call it adrenaline, but the Whitmores call it something else. They call it a miracle. Before we finish, I want to invite you to be part of our prayer community for the Virgin Mary, a space of faith and hope where people from all over the world come together to pray and share graces received. If you feel in your heart the desire to be part of this chain of prayer, click below and become a channel member today, and come pray with us. And if you made it here, to the end of Albert and Jimmy's story, do something for me. Write in the comments, mile 24, the moment when a father fell on the asphalt and got up in a way he can't explain. I want to see how many hearts this story reached. And every time I read mile 24 in the comments, I'll know that one more person believes that there are things that go beyond what we can see. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Write in the comments about some miracle you've witnessed or experienced, and share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.